A lot of people are talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer today, given the political and religious similarities between 2025 America and 1930s Germany. But what might Bonhoeffer himself have had to say about it all? For that matter, what does a big fan of Bonhoeffer have to say about it? Hi, I'm Brandon, and I'd like to welcome you to the Crucible of Thought podcast. For the last few years, I've been rethinking a lot of my spiritual and political positions, and this podcast is where I explore the various topics and their impact on the church and the nation. And this is episode number 145, and today I get to share with you a pretty wide-ranging interview with two Christian ministers, Ben Marsh and Bonhoeffer's child, of the Sacred Shenanigans podcast, discussing our theological backgrounds and political journeys, and spending some time reflecting on the limitations of modern Western evangelicalism. We talked a lot about our evolving views, particularly the tensions between conservative theology and progressive political sensibilities. We also talked about our concerns about the rise of Christian nationalism. Ben and Bon both emphasized a return to self-sacrificial, Christ-centered faith exemplified by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who spent the last few years of his life fighting against the Nazi regime and calling the church to return to a holy and missional walk like Jesus preached, and to look after the marginalized like Jesus did. Obviously, Bonhoeffer is one of Bon's heroes, and we kept returning to Bonhoeffer's ideas as we talked. And we also spent some time discussing our modern online engagement, the limitations of church structures, and our mutual hope for an authentic Christian witness in a fragmented society that's facing increasing challenges from all sides. So, enjoy the interview. Good afternoon, gentlemen. It's great to talk to you. We've been trying to get this together for a bit, and I'm really happy to have you both here today.
Thanks for having us.
Glad to be here.
My guests, of course, are Ben Marsh and Bonhoeffer's child, who shall go otherwise unnamed, and that's great. And so there's a third voice on the video. I'm only going to show two people on screen, and that's the reason for that. I'm really happy to talk to you both.
Bon's the handsome one, and so it's sad that he's off screen. But
I actually am well known to look like a sentient thumb, so it's better that nobody sees my face anyway.
That's all good. Hey, I wanted to start with a little bit. Your profiles both identify you as pastors or ministers, and kind of curious about that. Looks like Ben is a pastor at a First Alliance Church, which I know nothing about, and so I'm interested in that. And then what kind of background do you come from, Bon? So let's start with Ben.
Pastor at the Christian Missionary Alliance Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We're actually one of the oldest churches in our denomination. We go back to about 1885, 1887. And it's kind of a hybrid break off from the main lines toward Pentecostalism, but not quite Pentecostal, very mission oriented and very oriented around personal holiness.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually in almost the exact same boat, although I'm leaning in, if you want to call that, into an interesting mixture of, like he said, slightly Pentecostal, but high church. And my training was classic Lutheran, and so we're kind of an experiment.
Okay. And for my side, I grew up in evangelical churches across the board, mostly non-denominational, and then got involved with an Assemblies of God church for about 30 years. And it was kind of an Assemblies of God in name only. We were far more free-spirited than most of those are. And now I'm attending a United Methodist church because some of the changes I've been through in the last few years convinced me that really doing the works of Jesus was something that I didn't think that church was doing well. So the United Methodist Church.
My father was actually, he was AG. He was an AG pastor for a long time.
Okay. Yeah. So I get a sense that both of you have a fairly conservative theological position. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so the Alliance is pretty conservative theologically. At times, you would even probably historically have called it pretty fundamentalist. Part of several revival movements through the years. And if you go to some of our big names, A.B. Simpson and A.W. Tozer, I mean, those are both very conservative theologian and leader types. And so, yeah, we adhere to pretty straightforward evangelical doctrine and conservative sexual morality, conservative, you name it. The Alliance falls in that. The one thing that has demarcated the Alliance from what you might call traditional white American fundamentalism or evangelicalism is that we tend to be more international focused, and our churches have, at least historically, been on the vanguard of making sure that we incorporate people of different ethnicities, or at least try to. That hasn't always been the case, and definitely not the case in the South, but it's part of our DNA.
So let me ask you a question about that before Bon answers, but for himself. Given the content of what you typically talk about online and in your own podcasts, it seems you're certainly not politically conservative. How do those things balance out with a fairly conservative Christian view, but not so much on the political world?
Yeah, it's funny because that label conservative, in my perspective, has shifted. And in our last podcast, we talked quite a bit, Bon and I did, about my past. I used to work in politics in D.C. I was at a nonprofit that worked on religious freedom in and around the Bush administration, second Bush administration, George W. And, where those people are people that are now called rhinos and have been kicked out of the Republican Party because they didn't adopt the MAGA movement.
Right.
So I would still identify myself as pretty politically conservative and, can kind of go on that for as long as people want. But once you get categorized as being part of the out group of whoever is in charge of the current Republican Party, there is this kind of strange suspicion that, he must be from the other side. And, that's just definitely not true.
It's been kind of ugly to watch in the last few years, certainly.
It's been a sharp change, a harsh change, and severed a lot of relationships, including in my life. Yeah. Yeah,
I grew up strongly. My very first political experience was watching a Ronald Reagan campaign speech in late 79, early 80, something like that. And, so I grew up in the MAGA camp before it was MAGA, wrestling to Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and those types. So.
Yeah. And that, there was some of that when I was in DC, but there was still this kind of old kind of vanguard of republicanism. And I think the most important thing was the sense of institutionalism versus anti-institutionalism, and the sense of we're going to work through legal constitutional processes versus we just want to achieve whatever we want to achieve, as much as we can. Now, was that always true with the Bush administration? Certainly not. And I'm not a big Bush guy, but at least there was this sense of some sort of bipartisanship, some sense of operating within the boundaries of the Constitution. It obviously has devolved rapidly.
Yeah, certainly. So what about you, Bon? Any kind of thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I'm pretty in line. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Ben and I do well with our podcast is even though we approach from different points of view, we're pretty much in line on most things like that. I don't actually consider myself a conservative or liberal, theologically or politically. I kind of eschew any tag. But, I have been GOP since Reagan. And like Ben said, the party has changed. What I would consider to be GOP or conservative has nothing to do with what exists now.
No.
And, the party has changed. It's everything's different. And I, on top of that, the thing that I get called a leftist all the time, which I find incredibly hilarious. I just want to beg people to take a comp poli-sci class just for their own edification. But I really have a thing about, I reject all culture war, any kind, for any side, for any reason. And my big push, which I'm sure I'll mention at some other time during this, is that I'm my sole belief in how we're supposed to interact with the unbelieving public is that we're supposed to be personal sacrificial examples.
Yes.
And that example shouldn't match up with anything from any party or even most people's delineations of theology, because most theology is delineated by what people are rejecting. And my focus is hyper aimed at the cross and very evangelistic focus, trying to get people to the cross, to know Jesus, and everything else to me is secondary. I've said it before that online, that pretty much every doctrine outside of the cross is man-made, and that's a kind of a polarizing comment that has a lot of room for discussion. But I focus on the primary, and the rest of it I only deal with when I have to.
And ironically, I don't think that's a lot different than what I was raised to think that the Republican Party stood for. My dad was an associate dean at Regent University for a long time and an interim dean for a few years in the School of Government. So I grew up inundated with our ideas of how you should conceptualize the relationship between the church and the state. How the true believing church should actually pursue righteousness in government. And it's been said a million times, but I didn't leave the Republican Party. They left me. I think that's absolutely true these days. So.
Yeah, I think there's a real, I'm trying to think of a way I can put this. I know Ben would probably put it better than I will. He's better at this type of discussion, but I've got a real personal conviction that discussions about how faith and state should interact should always begin with the church and state should have nothing to do with one another. If there is influence from the church on the state, it should be because our lived personal example has altered society the way the early church did before Constantine's folly. And they influenced society by winning converts, by an example that pointed to the coming kingdom. And that changed people. One example of that, this is just an aside, one of the projects we deal with where I'm at right now is we've got several schools that we've set up in certain tribal areas where, I'm not going to go into the whole history, but these tribal groups are treated like bugs by the society at large here. They're rejected across the board. And so we went in, and we've been doing this for 20 years and have doing a lot of infrastructure build up, working with the people, and put in a couple of schools where the literacy rate in these tribal groups was about 98%. And only in the last 30 years has that started to shift. And so doing our part that we can, as we can. And somebody in the government here got wind of these schools and some of the different projects we did trying to build some things that were just for helps. There's nothing ecclesiastical about it other than just demonstrating Christ. And the government came in all of a sudden and built a bunch of structures. Basically, and I'm being a little broad here, but basically because they were shamed. The local authorities got shamed that other people were doing work that they had been tasked. And so to me, that is the only interaction between the church and the state that we should have. Not everybody's going to agree with that, and that's totally fine. There's different ways to do things. I'm not going to beat somebody over the head if they do it differently, but that's a personal conviction. I personally think that Caesar too close. I just want to run away the other direction.
And I certainly, I would have agreed. I would not have agreed with what you just said 5 years ago. When you grow up around Regent University, their entire mission is to create leaders for government, right? They want to take over. They're the Seven Mountains, type of thinkers there, even though they didn't adopt that moniker as such. But these days, I've certainly swung against that. And, part of it, I think, for me was learning about things like Constantine and what happened and how the church got to be where it is today. From a point of view of history, certainly changes your understanding a little bit. And I think there's just a lot of conservatives that don't really know their history much at all.
Yeah, and I tend to find that one of the nuances of this present moment is that I don't know how much that lesson has been internalized by the Christian left. Because there's this, oftentimes, that's one of the reasons why I reject the category that I'm some kind of progressive or leftist, because I don't want the ring handed to a different leader. I don't want Boromir to have it instead of Faramir, instead of Sauron.
Right.
We want to destroy the ring. And so there is this sense that when Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes, that there's no such thing as a Christian state, or there shouldn't be. We do not advocate for a Christian state in any form. that includes seizing power for the sake of what they kind of view as doing an overwhelming amount of good. If we want certain policy outcomes, and Bon and I have talked about this quite a bit, we advocate for them as human beings. We advocate for them for the good of others, and we advocate for them using reason, which is a gift that God has given us. We don't do it from the sense of, well, Jesus wants exactly this. That could be anything, universal health care, you pick any kind of social agenda that we might come in with. As soon as we attribute an overwhelmingly and uniquely Christian attribute to a thing, we ascribe to it a language that the Bible itself doesn't allow us to give. And I've even said it's like saying you have a Christian coffee cup. It just doesn't make sense biblically to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's really the Bible never says anything is biblical. I mean, that's a made up tag that we assign. We can assign it to, like you said, to things on the left or to things on the right or things in the middle. And we need to reject that.
Well, I think part of the problem comes from people that, again, don't know their history, and they kind of assume, and I heard this a lot in the course of talking to people that I walked away from their worldview, and they're very distressed by that. And the thing I get all the time is, we've always believed these things. Well, no, we actually haven't. Anything that you consider doctrinal or dogmatic is fairly new on the scene of human history. And when you realize that and you actually begin to internalize that, it forces you to step back from an insistence that you're correct and to leave a lot of room for other people to negotiate with you over, well, who cares who's right? What's the best way to work in this circumstance? But that's very difficult for people.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I treat this as a truism, even though I know it's not, empirically a truism. But when a believer or an entity or denomination or church is focused on the work of the cross, they rarely ever fall into these other issues where they start assigning policy lusts or views or partisanship to Scripture. And because when you are focused on the work of the gospel, and Ben put it really well in our last episode. We were talking about safe places, and he was mentioning making our churches safe for the unbelievers, not just the believers. When you focus on the people in need, when you're doing the work of Christ and literally picking up his cross, not the cross of partisanship or the cross of policy, you just don't have time to fall into these other issues. And you usually are so focused that you don't get sucked into the bad theology or the different hermeneutical lenses that people use. So
I really like that. And so Ben brought up Bonhoeffer, and I'm curious about the origins of your chosen moniker online. Where did Bonhoeffer's child come from?
It's nothing really drastic. He was one of my primary focuses in school. And as a matter of fact, I actually learned to read German because of him, so I could read the primary sources. As a kid, my parents always encouraged us to pick up languages. So I was one of those kids that was learning Russian because I figured within 25 years we'd either be at war with Russia or we'd all be witnessing in Russia, and then moved on and picked up other things. And that was one of them. But because of that, I when I was young, very young, I don't know, 12 or 13, I was already reading his stuff. My parents always encouraged that, and they had us read the same things they were teaching and talking about. I would say that the thing that drives it is I very much made him not mentor is not the right way to put it, but a goal of what I would like my life and ministry to look like. And that was my view as a very young person. The thing that got me was the quote from The Cost of Discipleship, that when Christ bid a man follow him, he bids him to come and die.
Yeah.
And my entire gestalt as a minister is rooted in the idea that our personal Christian life and our expression of Christ is supposed to be sacrificial, even to the point of our death. And I believe Bonhoeffer embodied that. I think he lived it. I think he taught it. It's incredibly sad to me that there was a gap of about 40 years where people really weren't taking in a lot of those lessons in outside of some of the mainline circles. But that's why I always look to that as I want my Christian praxis to, this doesn't sound right, but I want it to hurt. I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about others.
Well,
and not that I want to hurt. I don't want to hurt. I like life and I like being comfortable, but like anybody else. But Bonhoeffer embodied that to me as a young person and took that on. And so the moniker was a natural offshoot of that.
So I've actually been reading one of The Cost of Discipleship for the last week or so, and it is super challenging because he pulls absolutely no punches about how we should live today when, we're confronted with the gospel and how he preached it.
Yeah.
And, I observed that even though it was written in 1937, I think it reads like he could have written it this year. And so it's been challenging me just even in my walk.
Yeah. It was a rejection. That book in particular was a rejection, not just of state Christianity, but the idea that Christianity was meant to be for the Christian. It was a call for our faith to be for those that need it. Mm-hmm. And, we've all heard the cliche statement that a church isn't a museum for saints, it's a hospital for sinners. I think Bonhoeffer grasped that in an incredibly unique way. And that's one of the cores of that book. Anyway, I can go on about that further.
So just a quick anecdote about that hospital thing. One of the things that I had to walk away from with my former church, in 2021 was one of its strongest senses of self, that church, was that they were a field hospital, which sounds great.
Triage.
Yeah. But what I realized about it in retrospect was that the field hospital that they were talking about was fixing broken Christians to send them out to the world.
Yeah.
And so it was entirely internally focused ministry.
Yeah. A lot of American ministry these days, and again, Ben is the nice guy. I tend to be a little more cynical, and I lean on his niceness because he has more hope than I do most of the time. And I really enjoy being able to lean on his hope. But I'm a believer that about 85% of the American evangelical world is incestuous and is body-to-body ministry.
Yeah.
It's not actually focused on reaching those.
All you have to do is look at the budgets of megachurches, and you discover that
we spend more on chairs than we do on missions.
Oh, yeah. 1% of the average megachurch budget actually makes it outside their doors. 1%. Yeah. Which means, if I'm giving 10% of my money to the church, 1/10 of 1% of my personal
is actually getting out.
I can do far more by giving 1% of my income directly to a need than ever giving it to most of those churches.
I forget who did the study, but about 10 years ago, somebody did a study in the 5-year period in America. It was like 2008 to 2013, I think. The American church had spent more on building projects for their churches than they had in missions work or aid or anything else. By the way, I just wanted to add something. When you're talking about Bonhoeffer, I'm just going to pump something up because I really enjoyed it. Ben has been writing a series on Bonhoeffer on his Substack that is, and I am a self-confessed Bonhoeffer nerd, both academically and personally. It's excellent. And everybody should, when they get done listening to this, they should head over to a Substack and read it. It's really that good.
I will drop a link in the show notes for sure.
Not blowing smoke up Ben, but it's just that good. And it's very approachable. Very approachable.
So Ben, go ahead and respond to that. I think that's a great set of praise there.
Yeah, I am amazing. So thanks, Bon.
I see your Venmo just arrived.
That's right. Thanks. For me, it's that I like to read. I read in a lot of different areas, but one of the things that I like to do is when I discover something and I go, well, why didn't anybody tell me about this? And it's not because I'm narrow-minded or not well-read. It's because there's facets of American Christian history and really, international Christian history where we have just sidelined voices. What did Bonhoeffer really say versus what did he, say in Eric Metaxas's biography? What did Thomas Merton really believe versus what do we just like about his nice prayers and thoughts about, the monastic life and stuff like that. When you actually dig into the lives of these human beings that were living in crisis situations in the midst of war and that had a voice, you find out their voice was often nonconformist. And that becomes a threat to the power apparatus and, frankly, to the Christian publishing industry. So the Christian publishing industry doesn't forward out the true beliefs of a lot of these people because that's not what sells. And I find that there's this self-reinforcing cycle of capitalistic need in the Christian publishing and in the megachurch industry, where you need to tell people what they already want to hear so that they'll buy the books that you're publishing or go to the conferences that you're holding. And therefore you eradicate the teachings that don't conform with whatever's kind of broadly, acceptable within evangelicalism at the time.
The evangelical industrial complex is potent and not good for the church.
Yeah, it's not. So I whenever I read something and I go, why didn't I know about Bonhoeffer's Bethel Confession? Why didn't I know about this meeting that happened where he ultimately rejected even the Barman Confession because it didn't go far enough and it was too late? What put him on the vanguard? It wasn't that everybody around him was a liberal and he was a conservative. That's such a terrible misreading that's informed by Metaxas and has nothing to do with history. What really put him ahead was his theological convictions. And that's where I try to illustrate, and it takes time and effort to read through these things to understand the theology behind it. But without theology, and this is what I think has happened within evangelicalism, is that we're just not a theological organization, and in some ways never have been. But we're not bound by theology. We're certainly not oriented around theology. And therefore, we don't think seriously, morally and ethically when we have challenges like Donald Trump, because we don't have an operative theology, especially a political theology, that allows us to understand who he is.
I might amend what you're saying a little bit in the sense that I think that the evangelical church does have theology, but the theology is not fixed internally. It's always subject to the whims of whatever the social thing is that they want to attack at a given moment. So, hey, we need to deal with abortion. Hey, we need to deal with homosexuality. Hey, we need to deal with immigration. We're going to form a theology to fit that thing instead of saying, well, no, this is where we stand.
Yeah, well, a lot of that is that theology, no matter what it is supposed to be focused on Christ. That is the center he is the center of our faith, and his character is supposed to inform everything, not just our personal praxis, but our doctrines and our arguments for those doctrines. And instead they have, because their theology is thin, it's not thin because their understanding is thin. It's thin because they're not focused on Christ. So they have replaced the cross as a primary focus with whatever the current cultural war is that they're fighting. And, so they have a theology, and sometimes it's a thick theology, but it's not Christ-based. And that makes it really easy to get drawn astray. And I'm saying Christ-based is kind of reductive. There's a lot there, but it's really the only way to put it. When you are focused on the mission when Christ said, pick up my cross, it was not pick up my cross and, steal food from kids that need to eat at lunch, or fight this policy, or do this, or do that, or hate this person. And that's, I'm being really reductive. But the theology that is focused on Christ does what Christ did. It's just that simple. And there's a lot there that we can debate and we can discuss, and there's different ways to express it. But the core is, are we examples of Christ? That's what it comes down to.
The irony for me is that our church's focus for the last, 8 or 10 years that I was there was Jesus Christ and him crucified. Everything else should fall away. But when you actually dug into what that played out as, it wasn't doing the works of Jesus. It was, I think, my sense. I think our pastor had a great heart. He really wanted to serve the Lord. I'm not saying anything bad about what he was intending, but the way that it ended up being played out was it's all about learning about Jesus, correcting the way we think about things, and it was never about doing the works of Jesus. And that took going to a mainline church for me for the last couple of years to really begin to see, oh gosh, the church did a presentation a couple months back about all the things that church is involved in the local community. And Afterwards I kind of observed from my wife, how did we spend 30 years in that other church talking about Jesus Christ and him crucified and never once hear about some of these ministries that are going on in our town that are serving literally 100 people a day, with a meal that they would not otherwise get? How did we never once touch that thing? And honestly, to answer that question, I'll tell you what I concluded after thinking about it for a while. It's because as evangelicals, and more than that, as conservative white upper class or middle class evangelicals, we kind of instructed ourselves that if it didn't produce a permanent change in their living circumstances, we didn't do it. So we weren't willing to give welfare. We weren't willing to give out food. We weren't willing to house a homeless person because we weren't fixing them. And that was a shock to me to realize that, Jesus actually said there will always be the poor with you. And somehow that escaped our notice as good little evangelicals.
Well, a lot of that, and knowing the background that you have, and I was raised partially in that background, so I get it. A lot of that is the issue of, well, we don't want to deal with it because we can't fix them permanently, comes from a personal viewpoint that I am fixed. Christ fixed me.
Right.
And I am fixed. And so if I am fixed, then it's not that I'm better or anything else. It's that if they can't be fixed, it's because they're not submitting to Christ. They're not doing this. They're not doing that. They're rejecting. Then we don't need to focus on that. We need to go where there's going to be good seed that will be planted and will have good fruit and blah, blah, blah. And it's because a lot of them, and this isn't just in the non-denominational circles or the Pentecostal circles, and this is something that's an issue across American evangelicalism, and because of the heavy cross-pollination of the last 50 years. But our core, for lack of a better term, our core gestalt is very self-serving. And it's very much, what will God do for me, not what will God do through me for someone else.
I call it a McDonald's.
And that's a little cliche, but it's...
Yeah, I call it a McDonald's Christianity. And you put your coin in, you get out your burger. And we don't want to do the hard work of making the burger. We don't want the wrestling match, we just want God as a vending machine at some level.
And that's why I go back to theology. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you want to?
Well, yeah, one little story. I do want to hear what you have to say, but I've been serving at a homeless shelter, helping to lead worship there. And one of the things I observed is that the message that gets preached there on an average Sunday morning, if you really distill it down, is something touching on the idea of if you were better about being connected with God, then you wouldn't be homeless anymore, which is really toxic. I don't think they think that way, but that's the message that sneaks into everything that gets done there.
Well, I think they do think that way, and I think that's part of the challenge is what has happened. This is why I kind of go back to theology, because if you think historically, the categories of salvation and sanctification, the whole idea of, yes, I'm saved, and yet the Lord is still working in me to change me. We tend to just not, within evangelicalism, just totally eradicate those categories and internally be filled with self-loathing because we're not better than we think we should be. And then externally loathe other people who aren't better than we think they should be. Instead of having the grace that we ought to have as followers of Jesus to be like, I'm saved, I've got to go back to that reality. And then I am also in the not yet, the whole already not yet tension of nobody's going to get there in this life. Some of that might come from some theological perfectionism that was implied. A lot of it just comes from shame, where people are unwilling to confess and, admit that they themselves have failed morally in so many ways. And how does it play out? It plays out in all these pastors that are now being caught in all these vicious cycles of abuse or cheating on their spouses or whatever. And then it plays out on a personal level in our pulpits as people, I think, are psychologically externalizing their own internal self-loathing, now putting it on immigrants and refugees, putting it on the poor, putting it on the international population, and being like, well, they're the problem, or putting it on the other political party. They're the problem. It's so theologically bereft. It's embarrassing, honestly. I'm with you 100% on that all the way.
And I don't know if those things can actually be fixed. I mean, one of the results of my process of and reconstruction in the last few years is really concluding that I don't think institutional church is really the answer. It's a system that exists and we kind of have to work with it. But I think at some fundamental level, we've kind of put a lot of eggs into a basket that was never designed to carry eggs. And we've got a need to disciple people at a very intimate and deep level, a couple people at a time. And we've kind of turned it into this thing of Henry Ford-like mass production of Christians, where they're not really transformed. They're not really discipled into the ways of Jesus. They're just like paying tithes.
Yeah, there's an issue there. I was just the last thing you said, part of and Ben brought this up really well. Part of the thing about that people forget about living life as a Christian, whether you're a new Christian, whether you're a mature Christian, whatever, however term you want to use, is that the process of renewal does not end until you're dead. Mm-hmm. The process of renewal, there is no end to it. And we have taught that there is an end, often unintentionally. It's not necessarily that somebody is up there, you're going to be, renewed and God's going to take this out of your heart. He's going to take this out of your mind. You're going to be great. And some people might teach it like that, but I don't think there's anybody intentionally trying to say the process of renewal is short or there's a time when you're finally perfected. But because we don't emphasize that the process of renewal is a lifetime, we have lost something that, and I really like the way Ben put it. He said people, they don't face their sin, they don't face their own issues. Because we don't teach that renewal is a process that lasts a lifetime, there are things that people put aside and act like it's done and dealt with. What's his name? My brain just kicked out. Sorry, it's late here. Robert Morris. He molests a girl who's 12 when he's 21, and according to him, well, we only assume, but according to him, it hasn't happened since then. So in his mind, I'm done. I've moved past that. The Lord has dealt with my heart and he's dealt with my mind, and maybe I'm not perfect, but I've been renewed in that area. And so he doesn't deal with it. And then suddenly it comes up and it destroys him. It destroys his church. It has put his victim into no ending pain all over again as everything's brought back up. And it's because he never confronted the fact that renewal is a lifelong process. And if you have something like that in your heart, there are tools to deal with it. And the first one is accountability. You have to be held accountable for what you do. But if you don't even make it to that first stage, how are you ever going to have the realization that thing in you that made that okay is something that is part of your makeup, that it will be there until the day you're dead? It's like the saying about alcoholics. There's no such thing as somebody who's beat alcoholism. Once you're an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic, even if you haven't had a drink in 20 years. And so we have just completely ignored this issue of renewal. And I don't want to say, that's not a good way to put it. We have not ignored renewal. We have ignored teaching that it is a process that won't end until you're in the casket. And any refinement left from there, you got to face God and let him deal with it. I think if we could return to that, it would go a long way to the other part of what you said, dealing with the evangelical church can't handle this or that. There was never an intention by Christ that we know of to have the church splintered into so many different parts.
Oh, no.
And the focus.
In fact, he prayed against it in John 17. Father, make them one, even as you and I are one.
This is the moment when Bonhoeffer tells us he's so happy with the new pope. He's actually Catholic now. It just happened.
Yeah, I am incredibly happy with the new pope. I was incredibly happy with the old one. I am not Catholic, but guys like that are going to make a lot of Protestants go Catholic, and I don't have a problem with it. Actually, I'm one of those people that I have no doubt that our Catholic brothers and sisters are our brothers and sisters. They understand the gospel, and I don't get that's a whole nother discussion. I don't get this uber evangelical hate that people, they don't know, they're praying to this, they're praying to that. You just want to talk to them and say, if you could just sit down for 5 minutes and read a little bit, you'll understand how bad your take is. But that's a whole nother discussion.
Well,
I feel like the Pope, Ben, you're right.
There's much easier way.
You heard the joke. Oh, go ahead.
There's a much easier way to do it than sitting down and reading something. It's actually sitting down and getting to know one of them. And
getting to know them. Yeah, having a relationship. The nice thing about this new Pope, though, coming from Chicago, is that we can call him the Pope. And so, and now communion will be cheese curds and broths. So, I mean, it's good.
So,
anyway.
So actually you just bridged something that I actually thought was interesting, that I think is worth talking about for a moment. And that's about communion. With the things that you were just saying, I think there's an interesting crossover point there. One of the things I've become aware of in the last few years is the paucity of truth that happens in what most Americans would call communion. And when you reduce it to a little cup of juice and a little wafer, that you peel off because it's COVID friendly, right? That was never in view in the original writings in Acts and the things like that. And when Jesus was talking about it, and then when Paul and was instructing the church in how to do these things, it was always about a group of people a group of diverse people, because there were specific complaints about you need to stop cliquing off and forming into your own little groups and sitting only with the rich. And it was always about bringing diverse people together into an eating situation. And when you do that, you cannot fail to get to know them and begin to love them better. And also the word that was used for the church in those times was about citywide groups, not just like my little synagogue of 10 or 12 other men. It was the church coming together and having these love feasts.
It was a community.
Yeah, and so when we reduce it to this little wafer thing, or even the Catholic, version with the bread and the chalice, you're giving up something that I think is what brings about that John 17 unity, which is actually sitting at table with others, and even others, specifically others that are different than us, and forming relationships and forming a true community. So we've distilled it so far down in an institutional Western religion that it's lost that value.
There's been a it's hard to say it's across the board. There's a lot of mainline, there's a lot of high church, there's a lot of even classic evangelical churches across the board that do communion well and teach community, and communion is an offshoot of community to them.
Yes, that's true.
So we can't say it's all like that, but there has been a lot of it, I think, is the American mentality more than anything. But, our job, and I'm sure Ben would agree with this, and he'd put it far better than I would. Our job as ministers, when we're up in the pulpit and we are leading communion, or whoever is at that moment, is, to convey that we are partaking in a mystery. And that mystery is something we cannot fully comprehend or fully define, but we are doing it communally. We are remembering what Christ did. We're remembering his sacrifice. And it's supposed to be something that we internalize to produce disciples of Christ, that we want to seek what he did and do the same. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we forget that, or people don't focus on it enough. But, anyway, that's just my take. I'm sure Ben would put that far better than I would. He's better with that than I am.
Well, I think that for me, so much of the angst over what we're experiencing with respect to communion has a lot to do with the sense of American independence, that we're all kind of, I can do it on my own.
Right.
And then also it's gotten worse because of the whole relatively newer idea of the megachurch, which actually isn't that new. It's new in evangelicalism, but within Catholicism, you have cathedrals and people would go with thousands of other people. And I just think that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, as a pastor of a smaller church, but I was in a larger church, about 500 for a long time, how much different just functionally you do church when you have hundreds of people versus when you have dozens. And how much that maybe changes the way that we understand things or try to express things theologically.
Right.
So there's layers to that onion. But I do think go ahead.
I say maybe we shouldn't always be too harsh, because when you do have a large congregation, you do have to adapt to the size, time constraints, things like that.
Yeah, it's just a matter, I think, of how you express it. Again, it comes back to the theology of it. And then it also comes back to breaking the idea of gospel as product. Because I think that's the functional error, is that the more your communion consumption is just another product that you're getting from church as an institution, and not what you're doing as God's people together. So not what you do as church. And I think that's the functional disconnect, right? Like a lot of us were raised in or experienced contexts where church was a product that we went to, consumed, and then left, and not a body to whom we were participatory, whatever, and to which we belonged wholly. And I think that's a functional and a significantly theological different scenario.
I think Bonhoeffer's
that's well said.
Bonhoeffer's book kind of draws that point pretty well, I think.
Big time. Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious then, how does, because you guys have been participating in online social spaces for a while now, a podcast and your social media participation. I'm kind of curious for you as ministers or pastors, how does this public venue outside the walls of church differ from shepherding a church? Are they compatible? Do they conflict? Is there a boundary there?
I'm anonymous. There's no conflict for me. I mean, I don't mean that flippantly, but there's no conflict for me because I'm anonymous. And for me, it offers me a place to say certain things that I would never say in the pulpit. I refuse and always have my entire life to ever say a political word from the pulpit. I don't think Caesar has any place in a pulpit for any reason. And there are certain things that I will talk about politically online, not to take a side necessarily, but about pointing out what is wrong, what is a wrong direction, what is incompatible with our Christian praxis. And there's certain things that I just can't say in the pulpit, and I wouldn't, but I can online, and being anonymous, I can definitely say it. And it also insulates everything. The online community, there's people on the online community that I love and respect very much, but they are not people that I am in fellowship with every week, and so I do have to treat that a little bit differently. And it's not that I give preference to the people that I am in communion with every week. It's that I'm trying to protect one space and protect the other space, both from each other. I don't want the online world to dictate anything in the pulpit. I don't want the pulpit to dictate anything on the online world. That's just my take.
Okay.
Ben might view it differently, but that's just me.
Yeah, for me, it's a little different. And a lot of why I got engaged online had to do with, as a pastor, one of the things that every pastor has to wrestle with is that there are things about your personality or about your interests that can't be satisfied in the local body. We're all multifaceted. Every human being just has this range of things that they're interested in. And for me, a significant interest is in politics and political theory. And so I started being engaged online because I just wanted to have these conversations outside of a church that, kind of half and half, like some people care and a lot of people don't. And we also very clearly don't want to make that the emphasis of our pulpit either. So for me, it was like, what am I interested in? What do I want to engage in? How can I have these conversations? And frankly, to have conversations with authors and thinkers and podcast hosts and like people that I would never have access to other than previously Twitter and now on Blue Sky, who are just amazingly deep and thoughtful people that you get to ask questions of and personally contact and ask for resources. So it's a whole different universe. The other thing that I found, though, is that there's a lot of people that I have been connected to in ministry, in community, but I'm no longer in community with, former students, people that have moved away, people I grew up with, people I went to school with, that are like, I'm really confused as to what's happening within evangelicalism or within the church. Mm-hmm. Or I've walked away from Christianity, but I really am grateful that you have a different perspective than what I read in the news. And so for me, it's provided an opportunity to say, you don't have to agree with X, Y, Z in order to proclaim that Christ is Lord and Savior.
Right.
And because right now, there's no permission structure for that in most churches in America. I mean, if your church has a pastor who's a MAGA pastor who's handing a gold-plated AR-15 to another pastor on Sunday morning, as recently happened this week, you have no capacity to be like, I don't fit in here. What is happening?
Right.
You either leave the church or you don't. And so my perspective is that there's a lot of people that need the space to be like, I don't agree. So I'm not going to come in as a pastor and be like, you have to agree with me or you're not a Christian. But I am, as a human being, going to say, I'm a follower of Christ, and you do not have to hold to these tenets. You can disagree with them wildly and still be a follower of Jesus. And I'm just trying to free people from the evangelical political complex that's so dominant right now.
Yeah. You just hit something really good there too. Man, that was well. I mean, I'll give that a Shonda right there. That's my Shonda for today.
I want to get one a week.
Yeah, at least one.
I knew that was going to come out at some point.
At some point. Here's the thing. People forget that human beings have to be well-rounded. And church life is, and understand the way I say this is not a critique or an overt criticism. Church life, as we know it right now, tends to be restrictive. We only show one part of ourselves. And that's not just something in the minister, like he was talking about having other interests. Being online for me, like Ben, I think has been one of the best things because it has enabled me to connect with people that are outside of my denomination, outside of my circles, people that share common interests. And it has just been wonderfully expanding. But for the average Christian, that is deeply important as well. And they need to know, and boy, Ben just said it perfectly, they need to know that being a Christian has nothing to do with a specific doctrine you hold to, what denomination, how you take communion, where you go, how you dress. It all has to do with whether you know Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things I have a big deal with people, or they always online. The one thing I detest more than anything is like, well, those people aren't true Christians. The fact is, true Christians do evil as much as good, and non-Christians do good as much as Christians. I mean, it's not this delineation of who's a true Christian, who's this, who's that, is one of the most artificial and stupid things we've got. The fact is, as long as they have called on Christ, they are a Christian. Now, the question is, are they exhibiting Christ in their life or are they not? That's the question you ask. Are they demonstrating Christ in a way that will draw people to the cross? It's not a question of whether they're a Christian. That's a question that is something we bandy about way too often, and we use it to abuse others on all sides. That person did something I don't like, they're not a real Christian. No, they probably are a real Christian. They're just not expressing Christ in a way that demonstrates the coming kingdom and draws people to the cross. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to go on a tangent.
And Richard Rohr has a lot to offer in reconceptualizing how locked in we are to our own ideas of what constitutes Christianity and faithfulness. Yeah. And George MacDonald really threw a wrench in my works, when I was reading some of his material. So I've become something of a universalist, not probably I should say a Christian universalist or universal reconciliation believer, and being able to see others as faithfully moving towards the God of the universe without needing to put my particular label on them has been ministry changing for me, I should say. I'm not in ministry in a formal sense, but certainly how I approach other people to join with them to do the works of God certainly has been overhauled by that. Yeah. So it makes me want to, what you were just saying makes me want to ask, so how, this idea of being locked into one particular view and saying it's the only right one brings to mind these topics of Christian nationalism of here's the only right way to be an American is to be this kind of a Christian. And so it makes me wonder, if pushing back hard against that is helpful or not helpful, and how do we do that without, abusing that kind of thing in a different direction?
Well, I let Bond, we do good cop, bad cop. And then, I let Bond be the mean guy. And no, I think the help, to me, what's the most helpful thing? I was more strident. I was more kind of bombastic in the sense of these people are terrible. But one of the things that I realized is most people that are out there don't really understand when you say the word Christian nationalism, what does it mean? They haven't read Bonhoeffer. They haven't read histories of what happened in the 1920s and 30s Germany or in other times in American history or elsewhere.
Right. They don't even know who Father Coughlin is. Right.
Right. They have no, they hear a slogan, "Make America Great Again." They have no concept of how language like that was on KKK billboards in Eastern North Carolina. Right. I mean, they just, anti-communism being a centerpiece of the KKK as well. Like, because people don't really grasp the language. When you just go out and rail against Christian nationalism, they're going to immediately jump to, well, are you saying all conservatives or Republicans are Christian nationalists, and therefore all conservatives and Republicans are terrible? So I found it more helpful to try to focus on the educational side. Of late, I didn't do a great job of that last year, obviously, as I talked about in our last podcast with Bonhoeffer. But this year, my goal has tried to be like, let's get out there. What's really happening? Let's get out there. What's motivating? Let's talk about the theology behind the nationalists, and then it allows for some winnowing, because. And I don't want to go on and on this, but I think what happened is that Christian nationalists they're effective propagandists, and they use political division to sort people who otherwise would have theological and moral commonality in a lot more areas than not. But the nationalists were able to use the wedge issues, obviously of abortion, gay marriage, to use the wedge issue lately of immigration, to segregate Christians across the board, and then create an identity called Christian that is actually rooted in a very narrow concept of political. You got to fit in that box. And so to me, I'm just trying to break the box. To me, I'm trying to say, hey, you actually have more in common. Like, the reason why families aren't talking to each other now is because their commonalities have been erased, and instead their differences have been highlighted. That's the function of propaganda. Propaganda wants you to be divided, needs that so that you'll be obedient when the time comes.
Are you familiar with centered set versus bounded set theory?
No. Yeah. Mathematically, yeah.
So there's this great book, Centered Set Christianity, I think is the title.
Okay.
And his thesis talks about the difference between those two. And if, bounded set being, we have to put everything in a very strict box to be able to identify it as a member of that set. Like, this is an apple, this is not, whereas centered set would be, what's bald? Well, there's a range of baldness. There's an ideal, and then there's things approaching or looking away from it. And so if you start thinking about church more like a centered set approach, where we're focused on Jesus, that's enough of a definition for me, then I can walk with somebody else who has a very different concept of what church is or what Christian is, still moving towards the Lord together, or at least not moving away from the Lord together, and be okay with that experience, and that kind of upends a lot of those divisive kinds of things that go on between people.
Yeah. I mean, we see that, like, if you were to take an overview of who are people that, say, died during the Holocaust who were identifiably Christian, be that Catholic, evangelical, Baptist, Anabaptist, whatever, Lutheran, Bonhoeffer, etc. If you were to ask what unified them, it was their being centered on Christ, and then allowing the values to come out of Christ-likeness, which caused them to question the Nazi regime. Whereas if you were to do that bounded set math, they were wildly diverse, and they would not have been categorically similar in many ways. But all the people that were outside of them could bind them by saying, hey, they don't follow what we're supposed to do as good Christians, which is pledge allegiance to Hitler. So,
and what is a good Christian can be easily defined by any number of things in that way.
And that's
in a political sense.
Yeah. And that's what the propagandists do. I mean, I just wrote something about Stephen Miller. I went to college with him at Duke, and he was a propagandist back at Duke, and he was mentored by Richard Spencer, the neo-Nazi, to be a better propagandist. And he is just causing division in Christianity. He tried to do it at Duke. The guy wrote an article about how Duke doesn't celebrate Christmas enough. He's Jewish. And yet he wrote this article to try to get Duke, which was ostensibly a Christian institution, has a big chapel in the middle and a divinity school, to try to shame them and draw this kind of MAGA, early, like proto-MAGA, to himself on a national level. I mean, he was on Fox News when he was still at Duke, right? And so propaganda is dividing Christians intentionally so that they're whipped up into the froth to make the decision that they're supposed to make in the moment.
So I have two more questions I want to ask. Given all these things, where do we spend our political capital, our spiritual capital today? Is there anything we can really do?
Bon, do you want to take that one first? Do you want me to?
I'll take it first because you always offer a better coda to things than I do. Mine comes off too harsh. Here's the thing: you're not going to solve the problem. Everything we're facing right now, the world has faced before. And to be more specific, the Christian world has faced before. There is nothing happening today that has not happened before in the past 2,000 years. And so the cycle will continue because human nature is horrifyingly consistent. Human nature does not change. And so we're going to face the same thing over and over in cycles. The cycles are getting closer. We didn't really have something on such a wide scale before, well, I mean, and we always go to this because it's the easiest modern example, but what we saw, say, in the German state church and the split and the issue of identity and how to follow God and what that meant, that kind of a massive, on that scale, massive event hadn't really happened for several hundred years before. Now it happened 80 years ago, and now the cycle has happened again. And the next time, given the way technology has changed society, given the way we have instant communication, the cycle will probably happen again in 30 years. We just had it in 80. You can look for it in 20. I have a prediction on this. This is neither here nor there. I think as the demographic shift, the flip comes in America, we're going to see the cycle start all over again within 25 years. That's a personal prediction. Take it or leave it. I think what we're seeing now is nothing compared to what we'll see as white evangelicals realize that the demographic flip is imminent. And once they figure that out and decide to clutch their pearls, we're going to see this all over again. So in saying that, do I think we can change it? No, I don't think you can alter human nature. What you can do is do what you can do. And you can try to educate people. You can try to draw the ones that are willing to jump off the sinking ship and drag them into the lifeboat. And part of this problem is that we have this concept that we're supposed to be captains of the ship. That's where, Christian nationalism at its core is the idea that Christians should be the captains of the ship. They should be the leaders of the ship. But the ship is sinking. The ship was never going to float. It's going to end up under the water, buried 12,000 feet under the ocean, stuck in the mud on the seabed. It's not going to survive. We are the lifeboats. So what we can do is draw away those that are willing to leap into the water and swim to the lifeboat. We can save them. We can draw them away. Not everybody's going to be willing. And so I would say that first. Second, I would say that regardless of what we can and cannot do in a political sense, in a societal sense, our main goal and our main focus is still to draw people to the cross. As much as I opine on political issues online, and I do because I'm very politically driven. Unlike Ben, I had a minor in poli-sci, and it's not near as broad as his knowledge base. But I've always had that interest. But none of that has even a tiny speck of light compared to my desire to bring people to Christ. And I will sacrifice anything I have to bring one person to the cross. So that's just the way I was raised. It's how my brain has always thought. It's what drives me. And so if we get the idea, or I should say the understanding, that our goal is not political unity, our goal is not to try to change parties, our goal is not to try to push better policies. Those are great. I'm all for, let's push for things that will be a beneficial good to society. We all live in society. I don't want the canoe to sink from underneath me. I want it to, keep on going down the river and be stable. But at the same time, at some point, that canoe is going to hit some rocks and it's going to overturn, because that's the way society is. Human nature is consistent. What I've got to do is look beyond that. And what I have to do is look to that moment when we all face God, and we all have to be able to face him. And the choice will be, are we righteous when we face him, or are we not? Have we come to the cross, or have we not? Have we Have we met Jesus or have we have not? And you can interpret that in a number of different ways across people's different atonement theories and everything else. But that for me is what we're supposed to focus on. So if you realize you can't actually alter human nature, but you can point people to the author of humanity, then it becomes much less of an issue of, well, what do I need to do? I'll do what I can, but in the end, there's going to only be so much I can do, and what I can't do, I can't do. What I can do forever is preach the gospel and demonstrate Christ. And anyway, that's just my take. Ben will put it better as always, like he always does, but I think that's at least for me.
So before Ben answers, I'll just say one thing that occurred to me. What you were speaking about was Brian Zahnd talks a lot about exiles, and in his book, and us giving up the idea that we're in charge, and in fact, the truth really is that we should be satisfied to live in exile and to be the ones wandering in what is perceived to be the wilderness, rather than being running the show.
I'll go a step further and put it like this, and I don't mean this the way it sounds. I don't have a fetish for abuse, even though I know somebody said that to me once and it made me laugh. I think we should be satisfied with being openly persecuted and stepped on. I'll put it like this: where I'm at right now, I have preached in a village church where I'm at right now, where just a couple weeks before, 3 girls were blown to shreds because some guy rolled a grenade in because they were Christians. And when I preached, the blood was still on the floor. There's shrapnel on the walls. There's pockmarks. The funerals were horrific. There's nothing that you want to. I've been in some conflict zones where I saw a lot of really things I didn't want to see or experience. The one thing I will never want to experience again is having to deal with a burial where you can't even look at the people that are being buried because of what a grenade does to bodies that are only 3 feet tall. And yet their father was the pastor, and he was told, get out of town or this is going to happen again. What did he do? He kept preaching. Is that because he was some bold lion? And that's the way, if you talked about him and had him come into your church in the States, it would be, this is a bold lion for Christ. And great, that's great verbiage. I mean, no question the man is brave, and there's no question that he's committed. But the fact of the matter is, he did it because he was committed to the gospel. That's all that mattered. The politics didn't matter. The religious warfare didn't matter. It was that he was committed to the gospel. And I think that is the truest expression of Christianity we can have, personally. The early church grew the most and with the most fervency when it was under the violent thumb of empire. And when it started growing after Constantine's follies, because it was converting at the point of a sword or at the point of culture and tradition. And, great. I'm no question there were devout conversions in there. But for the most part, if you are a cultural Christian, I would always question if you have really, truly met Jesus. That doesn't mean you haven't. But, Mike, I would question it at first. So, I'm going to rabbit trail here, so I don't want to do that. I'm going to stop myself. But it really just comes down to, what is your focus? And if your focus is Christ, the rest of the stuff, it doesn't really matter whether you change people, whether you alter their policy lusts, whether you shift them from this theology to that theology, or from this doctrine to that doctrine. It all pales away. Is that all bad discussions? No, that's all stuff that we need to discuss and debate, and that's part of the way we're wired. That's great. But what is the focus? And if your focus is correct, the rest of the stuff just doesn't matter that much. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to. I rabbit trail badly. It's a bad habit. It's
good stuff. You want to wrap it up, Ben?
Our friend Caleb Campbell says we got to have missionaries to these people.
Yeah.
So if I'm the hopeful one, he's even more hopeful than I am. To me, there's so much education that needs to happen with people who probably attend your normie, not MAGA church, and are unaware of what they have supported intentionally or unintentionally over the last 10 years. Yeah. They don't know how much they have lent the credibility of the name of Jesus Christ to Stephen Miller, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Or Steve Bannon, or, name a far right figure. There are those that are like, yes, Stephen Miller is great. Those people just need to repent, because you can't agree with his language about immigrants and refugees and agree with the biblical language about immigrants and reguees.
Yeah.
They're two different categorical realities.
Right.
And so, that's but finding those two groups and helping to kind of separate wheat and chaff can be very painful and very difficult, because you will have two people that are sitting next to one another. Probably both of them voted Republican, but one voted Republican to ostensibly lower taxes or balance the budget or whatever other thing on that side. The other one voted Republican this past time because he agrees that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the nation, and agrees that Haitians are eating the cats and eating the dogs. Those two people are so different, but they are linked by the red hat. And so we have to find a way to reach them as different groups and not just kind of consolidate them one way or another.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's easy to mark. It's easy to say, talking about red hat with MAGA, it's easy to mark the group, the entity, the movement as evil as a whole.
Yeah.
But we have to realize that the components of that particular group is made up of diverse people with they've all got different reasons why they're part of it. But we do have to approach each one in a unique way. It's like, people, this is I'm going to rabbit trail here. One of the things I get hit with, I don't know if Ben does, but I get hit with online is, well, you just hate MAGA when you say things. I'm bad cop. I'm very harsh. It's just my personality. I'm very black and white. I'm a little bit cynical. I'm just kind of an old fart that, likes to let it all out. And I try to explain to people, I don't actually hate MAGA. I hate what MAGA represents. I hate what it has done to society. I hate how it has altered people, and I hate its products. But I don't hate the people in it. When I speak really bluntly online, I'm actually not talking to the average MAGA. I am talking to the Christians that are part of that, Christian nationalism, Christian MAGA. I'm not actually talking to the unbelievers or the MAGA that don't even hold any faith view. My harshness is for the Christians that should know better, but don't. And it's a way to let my irateness and my anger and frustration out. But like Ben said, you got to approach each one differently, and each one needs a little bit different language or a little bit different approach or different
ultimately,
argument.
I'm very pragmatic in this sense. Ultimately, every political movement is a coalition. We don't see that in America because we don't have coalition politics. We have a two-party system,
bicameral, or by party,
yeah. So if you can take the Republican Party impulses and really break down, and this is the work that we have to do in another 2 years, basically, and analyze, was there any deficit reduction? We know there's not going to be. Was there any budgetary reduction? We know there's not going to be.
Right.
Was there a drop in abortions? Guess what? There wasn't under the first Trump term. Currently, Donald Trump is in his administration is in federal court defending the so-called abortion pill. So what is he doing that you have appendaged yourself to a coalition of far right, including neo-Nazis, and allowed your name to be connected to theirs inseparably, that you're actually achieving politically? And for the pro-life movement right now, nothing.
Yeah.
And for the broader evangelical world, other than, wow, my pastor is in the Oval Office with his hand in the air, praying like the Pharisees do or the hypocrites do in public, blatantly breaking the law of Christ. Yeah. Other than that, I'm not getting anything out of it. But unfortunately, in 120 days, that's a very hard thing to do. Coalitions don't want to just splinter immediately. But to point out that your little part of the coalition really didn't get anything out of this at all is going to be a painful moment of truth-telling that's going to have to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of them they'll respond to it. And there's going to be a lot of them that will double down because of the sunk cost fallacy. They've already given their whole identity.
That's right. I've already given up every shred of morality. I've already given up voting for a good person. I can't complain about the morality of anybody else anymore. So if I'm willing to give up literally everything to achieve something and I've achieved nothing, well, I've already given it all up anyway, so who cares?
Yeah, well, there's nothing left. I actually think those people, I actually think when that all happens and they have this break, and I think a lot of them will have a moment of mental clarity, I think that's the best time to refocus them on, and I'm talking about Christians, refocus them on the true purpose of the Christian life. Now, whether that's something that will be successful or not, I can't say, but that's a good moment.
So the way I wanted to end this, I thought of this while we were talking, is we've touched on Bonhoeffer 100 times so far, and I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are, because I haven't seen it yet, about the Bonhoeffer film from last fall. Is it worth seeing?
I didn't see it. Did you see it, Bon?
Yeah, I did. I was going to say, do you want me to be bad cop here?
There's no possibility.
Short answer, but
cop. Yeah.
Let me start it off. I'll give you this. One, I didn't want to see it. I was kind of forced to. I have a personal. This is strictly personal. Nobody has to agree or follow this. I have this personal thing about watching anything that is faith-based entertainment. I won't watch The Chosen. I won't go see the movie King of Kings. Even the Jesus movie, which, hey, great. It's a great movie. I still haven't yet to watch The Passion. And it's a personal thing of, I don't think my faith should be monetized or made into entertainment. I understand when people like it. No problem. Not attacking them. It's just a personal thing. I put the Bonhoeffer movie in with that, but I kind of got forced to watch it. And I will put it like this. There's a lot of stuff in there that is good. And there's a lot of stuff in there that is apocryphal, that is not good. And to me, the not good outweighed the good. And I think the intent, I don't think it was an Eric Metaxas style total recreation of Bonhoeffer, although there were some real liberties. And some of it is really good. But there was enough stuff in it to me that I just was like, I couldn't. If I hadn't promised to watch it all the way through, I wouldn't have finished it. But I think for somebody that is not a Bonhoeffer fanatic, if they watched it, they'd probably get a lot of good stuff out of it.
So you haven't said anything that doesn't line up with what I've heard elsewhere, so that's fine. I haven't decided even whether to see it yet, but reading this book made me think I probably ought to, just to find out. But anyway, so let's. Go ahead. I was going to say something, but it'll rabbit trail way off. So I want to wrap it up, and let's just end on an upward movement. So tell me something you've seen this week, and I'll start. I think I'm very happy with what I've seen so far about Pope Leo. I think he's got some challenges that will beset him, but I think I've been pleased with where I think that could take us, even as a Protestant. What about you guys? Anything good?
Yeah. Ben, you start. You're always better at that than I am.
Well, it's something good. I always come back to what the Lord's done in our local church with our connection with the immigrant refugee population. Man, we've just had some cool stuff. Next couple weeks, we're going to be taking 25 refugees to their first a baseball game.
Oh,
great.
So it's
like you're going to have these Syrians that leaving war-torn nation, and now they're sitting there, not eating the hot dog, but eating some popcorn and watching a ball game.
They could be beef franks.
Yeah, that's true. They might have beef ones. I wonder if they're halal or not. But to have that scene is just so encouraging. To have on our night where we teach refugees, have some of them come in. We have a kids ministry and hang out with our kids. Their English is rapidly improving, to play basketball and soccer together. And then coming up here soon, I get to be a part of one of the weddings for one of the people in our Congolese refugee church. One of our young adults is getting married out of that church and have requested me to do it. So, you get to be a part of, and that's one of the most befuddling things. I mean, come back to the things that we've talked about during the course of this conversation. Like, it's so awesome that you go back, why are people afraid of this? Like, that nobody that I've interacted with from any of these countries have ever come in and been like, well, we just want to destroy American identity and, We just want to. No, they're like, oh, baseball sounds great. Like, yeah, I want to do a wedding and I want you to do it. Gringo pastor, I want you to do it. I'm, okay, well, I don't speak Swahili, so let's see how this goes. But they're not here to like, all right, we're going to create a mini ghettoization of our country back home. And, they want to work. They want to do what everybody wants to do. They want to raise their kids. And so it's just encouraging to be a part of that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And Bon, take us home.
That's great.
I really enjoyed the chat. I appreciate you both taking the time, and I'd love to do this again someday. But even if not, it's been wonderful, and so thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks. I
really enjoyed it.
Yeah. I like it because this will count as our podcast this week, Bon. So we get to check a box.
Yeah. Okay. But as soon as I get back, we got to record for the next week.
You got it, buddy.
So.
Okay. All right, gents.
We'll check our box.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
We'll talk.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you so much for having us.
I hope you found that interview both entertaining and useful. We really did cover a lot of ground, and as seems to be true with most of my interviews, we wrapped up long before I ran out of things that would be useful to discuss. So I guess I'll just have to keep lining up more interviews because I'm learning so much, and I really hope you are too as you watch. So take a moment if you can to like and subscribe to the podcast, and please let your friends know about it. Every new follower makes a big difference to a small podcast like mine. And as always, thanks for spending some time with me today, and we'll talk again soon.